It's great to see a good-sized audience out there. I think we're going to have an interesting presentation and discussion this evening. So the issue at hand is, what is the role of oil and pipelines in causing and perpetuating the endless wars in the Middle East, including the war in Yemen? To look at that question, we're very fortunate tonight to have Charlotte Dennett, the author of the book The Crash of Flight 3804, A Lost Spy, A Daughter's Quest, and the Deadly Politics of the Great Game for Oil. So within our peace movement, of course, there is discussion about just what are the key factors that are actually leading to U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and specifically military intervention. Some say oil, some say other factors, military-industrial complex, search for empire. So we're going to get into this discussion this evening with Charlotte's presentation. Charlotte will explain in her presentation just the title of that book that I just mentioned, and how her experience with her dad's death led her to look into this issue. Charlotte Dennett is a former Middle East reporter and an investigative journalist and attorney. She is the author of the book I just mentioned, The Crash of Flight 3804. Time magazine has referred to her as, quote, an expert in resource-based politics because of her coverage of politics and resource wars in the Middle East. Charlotte is also the author of the book The People versus Bush, One Lawyer's Campaign to Bring the President to Justice, and also the co-author with Gerard Colby of Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon, Nelson Rockefeller, and Evangelism in the Age of Oil. So you can see the areas where Charlotte covers are quite far-reaching, and we're looking forward to your presentation tonight, Charlotte. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm so glad that you could tune in. The purpose of my book and of this presentation is for you to develop what I call pipeline consciousness. And I'm going to take you through a story, a journey that I had, and show you how I had developed that. And I believe that once you have this consciousness, the Middle East starts to make sense. All the endless wars begin to make sense. And by the way, by way of introduction, I know you're interested in the military-industrial complex, for instance. All those elements, they're all intertwined. But one of the main reasons is to protect the oil. So I am going to have, let's see, is it Cole or Paul that has my PowerPoint?
Cole.
Cole, yeah. So Cole, can we start with the first one? There we go. Okay, so that's the book. And some people have said that we should have had in the title something like Follow the Pipelines. There was a reason why I put the crash. I can explain that later, but it sort of encapsulates everything that was happening at the time of the plane crash, the people on board, what their mission was, and so on. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. And that is a picture of the crash, which I was able to get from the National Archives. And it crashed in Ethiopia. There were 5 Americans on board. And one of them was my father, who I never knew. I was 6 weeks old when this happened. But one of the things that I decided later, after being a journalist in the Middle East, I started thinking maybe I was following his footsteps. And so began a long probe over many decades to figure out what was he doing at the time of this crash? Where was he? What was his mission? He was, by the way, America's top master spy in the Middle East at the time of his death. Okay, next slide. Well, there you are. And he had just completed a mission to Saudi Arabia, which is quite interesting. Continue, please. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. One of the first things I did was look at the New York Times. You know, they have a wonderful index, and I was looking at a time when there wasn't any internet. There were just, so you go through the New York Times index, it's big bound volumes, and I looked up 1947, and I got as close to the time of the crash, which was on March 20th. And lo and behold, I found this fantastic article in the New York Times. And so if you look at it very carefully, you may, let's see, do I have a pointer here? I don't know if that, does this show the pointer?
No.
No. Okay. Well, all right. I'll try something else. But anyway,
I think my mouse will show, but not yours, Charlotte, unfortunately.
Well, let me see if this works. If not, that's okay. No, I guess not. All right, forget it. Anyway, look carefully at this slide, and you will see there are 3 pipelines on this map. One of them is the projected Trans-Arabian pipeline, which runs through the peninsula of Saudi Arabia, and it has it ending up in Lebanon. That's the pipeline that I focused on because that's what my father was dealing with. But you will also see 2 other pipelines. They go from Iraq and then they branch. The northern one terminates in northern Lebanon, and the southern one terminates in Palestine. You should always come back to this because those pipelines are extremely important. I ended up figuring out what was the dates, the time when they were constructed. It was in the 1930s, and it was after World War I when the French and the British were beginning to divide up the Middle East. And part of that division was to determine where pipelines from Iraq were going to carry oil over to the Eastern Mediterranean. So the English got the southern end, and the French got the pipeline that terminated in Lebanon. And there were mandates, a British mandate that covered Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and the French mandate that covered Lebanon and Syria. Anyway, let's move on to the next. This is some of the quotes that came out of that New York Times article. So here we are in 1947, and there's already concern about the position of Russia. When we think about today, that's one way of connecting up to the present. They're always worried about the Russians are doing. And one of the reasons is because the Russians are much closer geographically to the oil of Saudi Arabia and the oil of Iraq and so on than the US. So that made protecting the Saudi pipeline very, very important. One of the quotes is, protection of the pipeline will become a prime objective of American foreign policy in the area, a focal point of rivalry between East and West. And it goes on to say the protection is military protection. How else are you going to protect a pipeline if not by the military? At any rate, after carefully studying this article, I began to get the pipeline consciousness. And what made this so interesting is that right from the beginning, Palestine and Syria are an issue. Let's go to the next slide. So what I learned is that my father's last mission was to find the right route to protect Tapline, the Trans-Arabian pipeline. And so I ended up suing the CIA through FOIA. And I got documents, as you can see in this picture. A lot of them are blacked out. But there's one document where they forgot to blacken it out. And this was this key sentence, and it was written by my father in 1944, early 44, maybe late 43. It isn't dated, but it was before he was sent to Lebanon. And he was sort of regurgitating everything that was expected of him when he went over there. And this came out: we must control the oil of Saudi Arabia at all costs. And that meant battling the British, the French, and the Russians. It wasn't, spying on the Germans, because they'd already left. So my father's job was head of counterintelligence, X2, for the OSS. That's the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence organization. And his job was to spy on his allies, even while the war was still going on. Next, please. Well, you can read it. What I discovered is what I call the great game for oil. That is, all your major powers are all vying against each other. They're still doing it. And one of the reasons is, and this is often not told, once you get the oil, you got to figure out how to ship it. And that requires either pipelines or tankers. So therefore, you're going to see in the following maps how some of these rivalries occurred and how they ended up creating endless wars. Next route, please. All right, this is another explanatory map to start things off. I drew a rectangle on it because people in the era actually talk about the rectangle. And when you look at that very carefully, what does it include? It includes the Eastern Mediterranean, which you can see, the Mediterranean Sea over there. And then what are the countries that border it? Again, they are Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And actually, at the time of the plane crash, it was still Palestine. Now, I was told when I was a journalist over there that Lebanon was the gateway to the Middle East. But what I later learned is if I were an oil man, I would say it's the gateway to Middle East oil. That's it. And there are major pipeline routes that are going to run through those countries. So keep that in mind. It's really important to look at the maps. The maps of the Middle East are crucial. And as one person, it was Naomi Wolf, who did a very nice interview with me at one point. And she said, man, once you see the maps, you can't unsee them. So let's go to the next. All right, I just came back to this, okay? I wanted you to re-look at this map. And you can see those pipelines pretty clearly. And then I even asked, when were these pipelines conceived? When were they thought of? They were thought of in the beginning of World War I and even earlier. And the reason is because Winston Churchill, as the first Lord of the Admiralty at the time, decided to convert the oil of the British Navy, the fuel of the British Navy, from coal, which Britain had plenty of, to oil, which Britain had none. And so when he made this conversion, because oil was going to be faster and more efficient and cheaper, when he finally made the decision, he said, we're gonna fight on a sea of battles. And lo and behold, he did. One of the great victories of World War I was the oil of Iraq, which you can see here. And the British ended up controlling that. But the French and the Americans eventually got concessions to that oil as well. Because this was conceived even before World War I, it puts into the question the whole issue of the Balfour Declaration that has been described as a reason for why a Jew should have the land of Palestine. The Balfour Declaration was actually just a letter, and it was written by Britain's foreign minister and sent to a Rothschild. And you can find their discussions among other things, as to how to pipe oil in Iraq and send it to markets. Palestine sure looked like a good place to do it. So you should keep that in mind because it's never said. This stuff is so often not told, and with the argument that it's national security. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. So then I started tracking pipelines, especially when war started out in 2001, the war in Afghanistan. Lo and behold, I found this article is from the New York Times press service. Look at what it says. War will be linked to the control of oil. This was before our military was even sent into Afghanistan, right before it. And if you read this carefully, it says that it's not just going after the perpetrators of 9/11 and the civilian casualties. What it's really going to be about is oil. And then the journalist presents a map of terrorist sanctuaries in the Middle East, and where they happen to correspond where some of the major oil resources are. So once again, he says, you cannot discuss the violence of this region outside the context of oil. And some of you may think, oh, well, too much emphasis, but trust me, once you get into it, it's just, please. Is something going wrong, Cole?
To me, you're fading out from time to time, Charlotte.
Yeah, it said my internet connection is unstable.
You might shut off
But,
your video and that way you'll save your bandwidth for your audio.
Okay. Okay, but can you advance the next slide? Ah, there we are. Okay. Now, I found out about this tap line, believe it or not, at a feminist conference. I ran into Ellie Smeal, who had read my book, my husband's and my book about the conquest of the Amazon and the role of evangelical missionaries playing a huge role in that. So I bumped into her and she said, "Hey, have you been watching what's going on in Afghanistan?" And I said, "Well, not really." And she said, "It's all about oil and Islamists." So then I started investigating. I came across a great book. I haven't got it here, but it's by Ahmed Rashid. And here it is. Just a second. It's called Taliban. Wait a minute. Militant Islam, Oil, and Fundamentalism in Central Asia. Wow, that just blew my mind. So I started investigating more, and then and he goes into great length. He was wondering who these Taliban are. He's a Pakistani. He was reporting here, and he eventually went to the headquarters of an oil company, and there were these guys with suitcases marching out. I can't remember if it was an oil company or maybe it had been the foreign ministry, but at any rate, he started tracking that. And what he found out is that in the early stages of planning this pipeline, the oil company, which is called Unocal, was going to rely on the Taliban to protect the route. And then there was a falling out with the Taliban right after 9/11. The U.S. demanded that they turn over Osama bin Laden and also to admit that he was responsible. And they said, "We'll do that if you can prove that he was involved." And no proof was offered. So on the basis of the Taliban resisting this request, the U.S. went in, and forces went in, wiped out the Taliban. Now, what you can see here are little balloons, and those are military bases that are placed along the route of the route to protect the projected route of the pipeline. This has still not been built. And the purpose was to carry oil and natural gas that had been found in the Caspian Sea, and it's landlocked. So, how are you going to get the oil and gas out of there? So this was considered the optimal route. But because there's been so much fighting in Afghanistan, it hasn't happened. At the Q&A, we have a wonderful guest that can explain how he found out that this was all about making the energy flow south. John Foster, I hope you jump in later on. You can tell us your story of how you discovered. He's been with the World Bank and many different organizations, but I'll let him explain that. Okay, next slide, please. So this is what happened when the troops were sent in. First, they went into Afghanistan, then in Iraq. And again, not told the real reasons. We all know weapons of mass destruction, right? That's why Bush had to go in there. But in reality, one of the reasons is that Netanyahu had wanted to restore that pipeline that carries oil from Iraq to Haifa. It had been closed in 1948 by the Iraqis in opposition to the creation of a state of Israel. So Netanyahu's dream was to open it up. And he even said, soon Iraqi oil will flow to Haifa. It's not a pipe dream. In fact, it was. You can notice here, I've on the map, British and Austrian. These are military people to protect the airfields around the pumping station. So, and I have a map in the book that shows that in the first few days of the war, the military was sent to different oil fields in Iraq. That was the dream. It was going to get this going. And you'll see more about Palestine, Israel's ambitions in the area. Next slide, please. So here we are. This kind of explains it. There have been huge offshore gas fields found off the Eastern Mediterranean. And the first ones were, which is called Gaza Marine, that was discovered in 2000. And then a much later, the Leviathan was gas, which you can see a field with a white line that sort of differentiates it. That was discovered, I believe, in 2010. Well, you can imagine how this is complicating things, because Israel has wanted to be an oil and gas corridor all along the Eastern Mediterranean. And because there's a lot of natural gas off the coast there, the Gazans have never been able to develop their share, even though it falls within their offshore boundaries that were established, I believe, by the Oslo Accords. So let's see now. One of the questions I ask, if you study this map, if Israel's going to run gas pipelines up through all of the Eastern Mediterranean onto Europe, what countries are in the way of this dream? So if you look at this map, it's simple. There's Lebanon and there's Syria. Now, when you put this in the context of the wars that have happened in this whole region, not only the attacks on Gaza, but Lebanon is essentially flattened now. It is a totally ruined country. I can't believe this happened. And Syria, from one of your previous presentations, is also in bad shape. It's suffering mightily. It sort of won the war, but the economy is terrible. And meanwhile, American troops have established themselves in the area of northeast Syria. And I mean, they just have occupied the region. It's Syrian sovereign territory, but they're there, and the Kurds are helping them out on that. Okay, next. Now we see what I call two competing pipeline schemes. And when you have to fit them all into a timeline, one of them was planned to carry natural gas from Qatar. I'm afraid it's cut off on this map, but it goes from Qatar, and then it goes up through Syria and Turkey, and the Syrians rejected it. Qatar has some of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, and they share it with Iran. They don't really share it, but it's that whole area in the Gulf. And so Qatar wanted to ship its gas to Europe and go through Syria. Syria rejected it. And the reason is Bashar al-Assad rejected it because the Russians didn't want it. And the Russians didn't want it because there's competition with the Americans for supplying natural gas to Europe. And this competition is still going on. All right, so after Assad rejected this pipeline, he said, I'm going to run a pipeline from Iran. And if you look carefully on the map, you'll see this other pipeline, the dotted line. It starts in Iraq, goes through Iraq, Syria, and onward. That's what he wanted to do. Now, this is around 2010. By 2011, the war in Syria is off and running. It started in a southern part of Syria, and people were resisting the dictatorial regime of Assad. But what happened is what began as a civilian revolt eventually became highly militarized. And ultimately, there are many who believe that the purpose of the so-called civil war in Syria was to bring about regime change. Israel wanted to get rid of Assad. The U.S. was pretty much wanted to. That was under Obama. In fact, it was difficult because they supposedly did not want more ISIS getting in there, or terrorists. And what would happen if Bashar al-Assad was deposed? Who would replace him? So you see changes in the foreign policy, but ultimately, as my book documents, there was a determined effort to destroy Syria, at least get rid of Bashar al-Assad. Some of you may have watched 60 Minutes last night as a whole expose on torture victims in Syria. I'd be happy to address questions if people want to ask. But that's how I certainly see the so-called Syrian civil war. The Russians have effectively helped Syria prevent regime change. And meanwhile, the Russians are developing the oil fields that are off of northern Syria. Okay, next slide. We're almost done, folks. Now we're in Yemen. You can see on this map, you will follow the dotted lines, and you will see that is the plan for a Trans-Yemen pipeline that's going to eventually end in a southern port called Mukalla. Now, one of the reasons that the Saudis wanted this pipeline to happen is that they were worried that Iran might stop the shipments of oil in the Gulf. And you will see in the upper right-hand corner of the map, the Strait of Hormuz. It's a critical area because it can be easily blocked off. So the Saudis thought, if we're going to get into really serious war or trouble with Iran, or what if they close the Strait of Hormuz, we've got this alternate route and it's going to run through Yemen. And so they have been constructing this pipeline. The Yemeni people don't want it, but it's going through anyway. And interestingly enough, when you follow the pipeline and look all the way to the bottom where it ends up in Mukalla, if you see that shaded area, that designates a group that are protecting it. And guess who they are? Al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, there's battling over the oil of Yemen. They don't want the Houthis, who are indigenous people, to seize control. But in fact, they did. They seized control of Marib, which is a major oil producing area. And so the Saudis don't want this. The Israelis don't want this. So that you've got this battle in Yemen going on with catastrophic results for the people that live there. And I'm sure you folks have all been following that. And you can see another choke point, interestingly enough, on the eastern side of, the western side of Yemen. You can see there's a flash point that says Hodeidah. There was an attack on an army tank, on an oil tanker there. And this other choke point called the Bab el-Mandab Strait. So it's quite interesting that in order to get the oil out of Saudi Arabia, you got to travel through these very narrow places, and these wars are continuing. Okay, next slide. Yes, my father was giving an address at Clark University where he was teaching history, European and Middle East history. And he was extremely knowledgeable on the history of Islam in the region. He got his PhD from Harvard on conversion and poll tax in early Islam. But this is the reason why he was so valued as a spy, because he knew the region. He had taught at AUB, American University of Beirut, in the 30s. And he actually he fell in love with the region and with the people. So any rate, he warned against sending troops back then. Now let's go see if there's another slide that comes up. Yeah, so thanks to you guys, put me in touch with Ken Cronenberg, who is doing his own studies of pipelines, and he takes you on a journey that begins in Massachusetts with pipeline people protesting a compressor station there, which was going to possibly leak very dangerous chemicals and oil in the region, cancer causing, and they didn't want it to happen. And as you can see, if you follow this pipeline, you can see that its projected terminal point is in Nova Scotia. And what Ken ends up doing is finding out that it is possibly through Nova Scotia that there will be natural gas delivered to Germany. And this is something that puts in a new perspective about the battles, the sanctions against Russia over the Ukraine, because, and also over the Russians building two pipelines called the Nord Stream pipeline that end up feeding Russian oil and gas to Germany. And the Americans don't want this. They want fracked gas to go to Europe. And so the pipeline wars are still going on. And anyway, perhaps I'll be able to provide you folks with the links to his study, because the same thing happened to him. He started a small area and then started probing, and the next thing you know, he's finding these international connections. So that's why I want to end my talk by saying it's time to connect with the other pipeline trackers so that we can give you the full holistic view of how this very hidden game is playing out in the world today. So that is the end of my talk, and I'd be happy to take questions. Maybe I can I put the, thank you very much, Cole. Can I put the my video back on? Let's try and see
Okay,
if it works out.
give it a shot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Charlotte. A lot of provocative thoughts there. I think we'll open it up now for questions. First of all, in getting to the questions, I wonder, Michael Hoey, are you there? You might have a question or a comment on Charlotte's presentation.
Well, that's too bad because it was Michael who
No,
was.
no, I'm here.
Oh,
no,
you're here. Good.
Sorry
Good.
about that. Yeah, I just couldn't unmute for a minute. So anyway, yeah, it's awkward. I mean, it seems like oil is war juice, and since we're the #1 seller of weapons, we need to, provide access to the fuel that keeps them going. And it seems to play out all over the world, not just there in the Middle East, but it seems to intensify every year. So that, I guess, is why we have all these guys that go around and do this. I mean, I don't have a question right now, but I realize that many people have written on this topic. Daniel Yergin talks about it in the prize. And most people who understand what's going on realize the importance that oil and natural gas play, and that they're not going away tomorrow, no matter how many windmills we put up and solar panels, that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So I'm really grateful that you brought the Middle East part of it to our attention.
Well, that was well summarized, Michael. Good job. And yes, it's going on. It's kind of depressing because the majors are investing in alternative energies because they can afford to, and they probably see the writing on the wall. But at the same time, they're not going to back out of these great game battles that are going on in Europe, also in Africa. I've just begun to apply my pipeline consciousness to Africa and finding, yes, places where U.S. troops are stationed are in fact near oil reserves. If you folks get into towardfreedom.org, that is an online magazine, and do a search on Africa. I was a guest editor there for a while, and I published some stories about how they're definitely penetrating Africa now. I mean, there are other minerals that are after too, but it just seems that oil and gas reign supreme. There's nothing more important to them than that, because it fuels the military.
Charlotte, let me ask you a quick question before other people ask their questions, and that's the ability of the average person to tap into those pipelines. So my understanding when you bring up Africa is that occasionally some of the tribes have found ways to go out in a remote area and put holes in the pipeline and then get the oil and put in barrels and sell it. And so that was one of the concerns.
Yeah, that's very good.
With natural gas, but
yeah,
at least
that's
with oil.
Yeah.
Have you encountered that anywhere else?
Absolutely. I mean, this is what they worry about. That's why when they, the big powers, the oil companies and their respective governments and defense departments are always worried about it, because it is easy to sabotage a pipeline. There were pipeline sabotages going on in the 30s in Palestine, for instance. And there have been current ones. So yes, in Africa, I can well imagine that they may have been punctured, and so you will see where the militaries are sent to protect those particular pipelines.
Okay, well, why don't we open this up to questions? If you
Could I
have a question,
could I butt in with a comment, Paul?
go ahead, Paul.
I just wanted to bring out that, you mentioned the Weymouth compressor station, which many of our colleagues and comrades here have been opposing for years. It is open, but there's now a new court case that has a chance of stopping it, or a regulatory case of closing it down again. But the other one I wanted to point out is the Line 3 pipeline is a current struggle in Minnesota.
Yes.
Some of the MAPA members have been out there trying to stop that, and they're desperate. The Keystone XL and the Dakota XL and the Line 3 are all various attempts to get the tar sands oil to market. In Alberta, they've been converting this tarry stuff into oil at tremendous environmental cost, and so now they have to have pipelines to bring it out. So there's an indigenous-led struggle in Minnesota to stop that particular pipeline also. So, as we've seen from Charlotte, it's either in the US, they may use one type of strategy, in the Mideast a different type of strategy to get their oil flowing, but it's all about money and oil.
Thank you, Cole. I'm so glad you added that. I was looking through the stuff that Ken sent, and I just didn't have time. But that's it. And we got to start making these connections.
Okay, let's go to people. If you have a question, raise your hand, and let's see.
So you can raise your hand with the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom window, or you could actually just type your question into the chat if you can't figure out any other way. Or you can try waving your hand around like this if somebody sees you. Theresa is doing that. So
okay, but I see a couple of raised hands here first, and then we'll go to Theresa if that's okay.
Sure.
We have Wade Willington. Cole, can you unmute him? Or he is unmuted, I guess.
Wade.
Yes, sir. How you doing? I appreciate the information that you have in your book, and I've looked through the things that from what you were speaking of. The JCPOA, for me, is the crux of what's going on right now. This week, if they do not sign the JCPOA, I think that we're going to have a problem in the Middle East because of those pipelines. Because as you say,
could you just tell people what the JCPOA is?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was put into place, it started with the Obama administration. Right now, it's supposed to be finalized with the Biden administration. They signed on allowing the Iranian oil to come back online. But the problem with that is that the other countries, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, and Bahrain, those other countries, are coming in saying that they don't want that to come on because of the strategic placement of Iran. Because it's right now, Iran now has the Chabahar port, Guadalajara port, which bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. Now that they're drilling a line straight from there, they're building a line from Iran straight to China. So I see this is why Israel is bombing up the other place. I'm glad to hear that you was talking about the Haifa, because that has to do with that same line through Syria. So my thing is this: what do you think is going to happen if the JCPOA is not signed in 2 days from now?
Wow, that's a really good question. And I've been on shows where I'm asked that, and it's so hard to predict. I mean, especially because of the elections, which put the hardliners in power. But the information that has been put out sort of stresses the positive aspects of ongoing negotiations. Now, here's the thing. The Iranians want the sanctions stopped. That is crucial. And I think that they figure that the only way they can get those sanctions stopped is if they go ahead with the nuclear agreement. The West definitely wants the agreement because they don't want instability. They actually don't want it. It's so they're hoping that they can pull this off in any event. And they'll just have to deal with the Iranians. But it's so potentially explosive in that part of the world. We've already seen, the Iranians have exercised considerable restraint, in my view. I mean, they had Soleimani, their top general, their top commander, assassinated. Then they had their top nuclear scientist assassinated. So, but they held off because they held off retaliating in any huge ways, because they wanted the deal to go back through, and they wanted the sanctions to end, and they wanted some of the money that's owed them that had been seized after the 79 hostage crisis to be given back to them. So I cannot predict. It's too hard to predict in such a volatile part of the world. One flash could start the whole thing off. And somebody, by the way, somebody asked me what's behind the Beirut explosion. That it's been a year now, and they still haven't got a full investigation or a report about what caused it. As I have often said, who lit the match? I don't care if it was very inflammable material that destroyed their harbor, but who lit the match? And you see, this is what happens in the Middle East. You get cover up and corruption. And Sherry, are you all right? It's my husband having a coughing attack. Anyway, I can't answer you, Wade. What do you think?
Well, this is my thing. If they don't sign that agreement, they're going to switch out of, they're going to cancel the JCPOA. Then they're going to go over to the SCO, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which goes outside of the SWIFT system. So which means that they're able to bypass the sanctions altogether, not use the US dollar altogether, take the pipelines, and then at the same time hook up with Yemen, because Yemen is right there around the corner.
Yeah,
this is why we have our troops over in Djibouti, because of the Yemenese situation right there on the pinnacle of that. So
right,
that's what I see.
That's good. And can I just ask a real quick question to you, Wade? How did you develop pipeline consciousness?
Oh, well, it started back in the 70s.
Okay.
It started in the 70s when we had the gas shortage.
Oh, yeah.
And when I saw everything going the other way, my father explained some of the things to me. But then as I started growing up and looking at everything and saw the prices, how all of that affected everything, how it affected everybody's lives, pension plans. I saw people lose their pension plans over that, lose their houses and everything because of the oil situation that we had.
Right.
So that brought my conscience to where I knew I had to follow this for the rest of my life.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you, Wade.
All right, thank you.
I want to go into some of the other questions here. We listed people. Sure. Theresa, you were next. Theresa Turner. Oh, unmute yourself, Theresa. There we go.
Hi, Charlotte. I really love your work. I've been following it for decades.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you.
I want to make 2 points. First of all, I've worked a lot against the oil industry in Nigeria and in West Africa, along the coast, Ghana, and so on. And over half the total production of Nigerian oil is siphoned off. It's those often laid off oil workers who drill into the pipelines and transport the very high quality crude oil, 34 API crude oil, offshore and sell it to the tankers and the shipping that is on the west coast of Africa. And it can be burned directly like fuel oil because it's so high quality. So a massive, massive theft of oil is going on there. And I would suspect not only there. It's very easy to steal oil from a pipeline. And there's a saying in the industry that you cannot protect a pipeline. And in lots of ways, that's true because of the extent of it, the vulnerability, the ease of being able to destroy it. Whether often it's a matter of poor workmanship, poor materials, pipelines leak all the time. So the resistance to the oil industry in West Africa, which of course is bringing on the military involvement of the US there in that region in a heavy way.
AFRICOM.
AFRICOM, exactly. the resistance is, of course, there's a lot of thuggery and kidnapping and gangsterism, but there's also a huge peasant uprising led by women. Why women are at war with Chevron is a thing I did with Lee Brownhill in 1993, I think that was published. And we see how that resistance spreads around the world. So that's one point. The other thing I wanted to ask you directly about is fossil capitalism. Many of us have read Andreas Malm's book, Fossil Capital. And he, like you, ties coal and petroleum, natural gas, tightly into the development of industrial capitalism from the 1820s really to date. The question then is, do you believe that we can deal with climate change? You know, we can shut down Weymouth, we can shut down Line 3, we can shut down the tar sands, we can deal with all these pipeline politics without a conception and an objective to deal with capitalist relations themselves.
Wow, you packed a lot in there. And I have not read Fossil Capitalism. I'm sure to get it now. Well, that's another thing that is very rarely discussed when the crises happen in the world. I mean, when have you ever watched TV or covered races and so on? The system hardly ever comes up. It's just a no-no, and so it is very connected. So I don't know how it's going to end. I think that climate change is so drastic and affects everyone. I mean, they got to see the writing on the wall. They've got to get over this this great game, and if they can develop, and I'm sure they're doing this, the Pentagon is investigating alternative sources for their fuel, so that they don't have to be so reliant. But I don't know. I mean, greed has a hold, and capitalism is a system where you got to constantly beat out your competitor. That's what it's all about. And if you don't, you lose. So the future does not look terribly rosy. And the only thing I can think is that, well, I tend to be hopeful and an optimist. And one of the things I'm hoping is that out of this horrendous COVID pandemic, people are just going to start thinking differently. They already are all over the world. And I draw on a historic parallel, and that is the Black Death, which happened to strike Italy very hard, and the town of Florence. And I did my master's degree in Florence, of all things in art history. But I saw this mural of the Black Death. And then I read and discovered that one of the things that came out of it was the Renaissance. It was the birth of capitalism, actually. Many things conjoining at the same time. But part of it had to do with it was so horrendous. They had to come up with something new, and it was the Renaissance. And by the way, quarantine comes out of the Italian word quaranta, when ships had to stay offshore for 40 days before they could unload during the Black Death. So that's an interesting angle. So I like to think we're going to have a new Renaissance and new thinking, and that is happening. I think everyone should clip out examples of forward thinking and new ways of looking, and who knows, we might climb out of it.
Okay, thanks,
I
Charlotte.
can't resist putting up Andreas Malm's new book that's just out.
Oh my goodness. How to blow up a pipeline. Well,
okay, we'll get to that. That comes after the event tonight. Lynn Siegel is is the next person. Lynn, could you unmute yourself? Or Cole, can you unmute Lynn?
Lynn.
Siegel.
What I wanted to know specifically, Charlotte, is this boat with the nitrogenous explosive was on its way to Mozambique, care of Russia, from Moldova, which is between Romania and Ukraine. And then it, docked up there. Apparently some other ship previously had problems, like physical problems on the ship. So though that kind of thing could happen, you could argue, but it was tripped up there because it wasn't paid for. Okay, afterwards, the same shipment was made. It was going through the Suez Canal down to Mozambique. So what's the explanation here? Are there being oil trades done like they can get nitrogen in Mozambique because they've traded somehow through oil for this war machine? Or
Well,
I just don't understand it.
I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with those particular incidents, but there's a lot of. I have been told there is a lot of sort of secretive deals that are struck about shipping oil, and but I can't refer.
Oil, this is nitrogen.
Oh, nitrogen. Okay, yeah. Well,
because it's the nitrogen that got stuck there because somebody didn't pay their bill.
oh, is this the tank? Is this the tanker that was stuck in the? Yeah.
And then it blew up. After it had been sitting there for so long.
Oh, it blew up. I didn't know that. Well, anyway, I can't answer it.
That's what destabilized Lebanon now. That was one of the things, along with everything else.
Yes.
Well, we'll have to look into that situation because most of us are not too familiar with it. But Charlotte, I wanted to ask you, since we have been working at Mass Peace Action quite a bit on Yemen, if you could, I don't think too many of us are aware of a pipeline that Saudi Arabia is building through Yemen. What is the status of that pipeline and when was it conceived? Anything you can tell us about that pipeline from Saudi Arabia through South Yemen?
Well, first of all, you can get my book because it does describe how it started and who was responsible. And the last time I looked, it's being built, and there has been some resistance to it. Now, I checked on that about, 4 months ago, and I should have checked right now. But you can, it's so easy to do. You can just Google Yemen and then pipeline or what are they calling it? Trans-Saudi pipeline. Anyway, if you put the right words in, you will get the latest information.
Is the pipeline built yet?
No, a part of it is. It's being built. It hasn't. I don't think it has crossed into Yemen yet, but I'm not sure. And so I would really encourage you to just Google it. See, you'll get it. You will get the update.
Do you know when the idea of the pipeline was developed? Was it developed recently?
No, I think the idea of it was probably around 2015 when the U.S. started, getting involved in Yemen and sending in huge amounts of military supplies. And that happened, under the Obama administration. And then it has escalated under the Trump administration. So I think that was when it was conceived. And that's how I can answer your question.
Okay, thank you. Next question is John Foster.
Hi, John. Nice. You unmute yourself.
Cole, can you unmute John?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, fine. I had to unmute myself, which is quite difficult. I'd like to say to Charlotte, what a wonderful, great talk you've been giving, and what an exciting book you've written. I think it's terrific. and also interwoven, of course, with your personal story to do with your quest for your father and what happened to him. Charlotte asked me to say one, just make myself known, I guess, because coincidentally, I had also written a book which looks like this about oil and world politics, and I covered some of the same countries, of course, always from a different phraseology, but on the same wavelength as for example, in Afghanistan. And we've each come to these the excitement of pipeline politics from a different beginning. Mine was, I suppose, Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and these wars that seemed to multiply as one kept looking. So I traced out the Afghanistan story and went into writing in Canada, where I live, about this. And then came 2011 and the events that Charlotte's been describing to do with Syria and Libya. And there seemed to be no end to these countries that were being attacked militarily. But now what we're seeing, it seems to me, is not that, except for some rearguard actions, as in Syria, but economic sanctions, which to my mind is still another form of warfare. And so that's the story for Venezuela and the story for Iran. And of course, to have their oil knocked off the market for everybody else, including Canada, is very good for price. And it's very good for markets, because the Venezuelan oil doesn't go into those southern Texas refineries. Instead, the oil sands, bitumen goes into those refineries. The final game, Charlotte used the words, the new great game. And it made me smile a bit, because I've been using the phrase the petroleum game, which all governments play. And of course, the biggest governments play it most of all. And I would say most of all, the United States, also Russia and China. And which led me to myself now start to look heavily at the Russian pipelines and the Chinese pipelines. And the other thing I liked very much in your presentation was the emphasis on maps. I think maps are absolutely crucial. The whole thing is a lesson in history. It's a lesson in geography. So thank you so much.
Oh, John, thank you. We're meeting for the first time, folks.
We've been exchanging emails.
Yeah. So it's great to hear you, and I will certainly follow up, plan to read your book. But yeah, it's the maps. The maps really do it. And I might want to add that, my book, which is the work of 4 decades. I mean, I did things in between, but I kept searching and searching. And it came out in April of last year when the lockdown happened. So all my events were canceled. The bookstores weren't gonna order my book because they were closed. So I'm trying to give my book a second chance. I'm just saying. And I hope some of you who follow this issue or are intrigued by following the pipelines will consider getting a copy and telling your friends about it, because this is a book that I want people to have, to see, and then to start applying their own pipeline consciousness to some of the most major battles in the world. Anyway, you can get it on Amazon. That's the easiest place to get it. But also the publisher, Chelsea Green. I would really appreciate that support. I'm trying to get it into paperback, but I don't know if I will succeed. It was hurt so badly during the pandemic. I'm one of those people.
Charlotte, everyone on the call tonight will get information about the book and how they can get it. Everyone will get an email tomorrow from Brian.
Oh, thank you, Paul.
Brian Garvey at Mass Peace Action. We only have time for maybe one more question. Michael and Wade have already asked him, but why don't we go back to Michael, and we'll see if we have time for Wade's final question. Michael Hoey.
Yeah, so my question deals more with the the spy network that we have, or the assassins. So in 1983, there was a Beirut bombing by a guy that was, I think, a co-leader in Hezbollah and a part of Islamic Jihad, I think, or Hamas, I'm not sure, but anyway, Mugaye, I think. And then he was killed, I think, in 2008. So it took us 25 years and millions of dollars, numerous agents to follow this guy around. And then we finally killed him with a car bomb in Damascus with the help of the Mossad. So he was like our number 2 person, actually our number 1 before Osama bin Laden, but after Osama bin Laden, he became our number 2 most wanted guy to be dead. My question is, this took 25 years, incorporated numerous intelligence services, numerous agents, and went through multiple presidencies. So apparently the kill order was given under Reagan. How common is this if someone offends the imperial interests to, put a kill order on them and have it follow through multiple administrations, through multiple countries, spending millions of dollars to kill someone who killed a few Americans?
Honestly, I don't know. I can't answer that, Michael, but, the intelligence services are deeply involved, as you probably know. I don't know if you folks know, but interestingly enough, the CIA actually invited me and my family to their headquarters because they're finally acknowledging the role of my father. But in the early days, and they say they want him to be a role model because he was close to the people. That isn't happening anymore. So there are all sorts of intrigues that go on, but espionage is absolutely central. One of the God, my dog is barking for some reason. One of the reasons why I can't concentrate. I gotta go I don't know what's going on. I'll be right back. Maybe you can, I don't know. Do
Okay,
something.
we'll have Wade make the final comments here. Wade Wellington, sorry.
He needs to unmute.
Okay. My thing was, I know that Saudi Arabia is pumping, for every 10 barrels, they're pumping up about 8 of water. That's why they're trying to get to Yemen, because their reserves are running out. But my question to her was, since that's going on, when Iran comes back on board, does she see the Iranian rial increasing to the same exchange rate as the Saudi rial?
Can't answer that. I'm sorry, Wade. You may be ahead of me on that. But one thing I do want to say is it's another issue that is coupled with the whole game. And that is, what is the currency that's used to buy the oil, sell the oil, and so on. And if you start looking at this carefully, for instance, Libya was one of those countries under Gaddafi that was considering creating, I believe it was their own currency. They
It was Libyan back currency was gold.
Yeah.
And I know that they're doing that right. They already have that passed in parliament in Iran and also through Iraq.
Well, there you go. You do need to look at banking too and understand that component to the whole thing. And once these countries stop using the dollar, that can seriously hurt the empire.
Yes, our empire, U.S.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Well, thank you again, Wade, and Charlotte. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you spending the evening with us. And
well, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate that you hosted me.
Okay, and thanks very much to everyone. As I mentioned, you'll be getting information tomorrow from Brian on access to the recording of tonight's program, but also some of the resources that Charlotte mentioned. So good night, everybody. Thanks, Cole, for running the show. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
And thank you, Charlotte. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you, Paul, Cole, Brian,
Okay.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, so Brian might still need to get the names of a few of those publications from Charlotte. There is that magazine, I think.